So today's talk is a brief, insightful chat about how geographic information science techniques are being employed to fight COVID-19. We have Dr. Inbal Shakam here, who's an expert in infectious and chronic disease predictive spatial modeling. It's a mouthful there. And she's both faculty co-lead at the Geospatial Institute at St. Louis University and the director for SLU's Public Health Studies program. So there's no handouts, there's no polls today. It's actually a really quick one, just about 10 minutes. So please enjoy. And next week, we will be talking about U.S. qualification for professional programs. So specifically, we're going to look at becoming a dietitian, a nurse, or a psychologist. So without further ado, I will hit play and we will hear more from Dr. Inbal.
You know, in the work that St. Louis University has been doing, it's probably similar to lots of other universities, but we're really focused on thinking about from the virus to the satellite, really, because we're uniquely positioned to thinking about with colleagues at the School of Medicine as they're working to develop tests and treatment options and vaccine and test those in our community members. And we at the Health Lab at the Geospatial Institute are working on many different projects, and some of them are collaborative with that School of Medicine effort as well. But generally, we're looking how to best identify predictors around COVID as it's anchored in location. The diversity and impact in the vulnerable populations that we experience in the St. Louis region, but also throughout the world, we're seeing who is more affected. And now what we're trying to do is identify why. We started by looking at mapping at areas that are at particularly high risk because of their chronic diseases and the rates of chronic diseases. And then we were able to look at developing an app to monitor symptoms for employers and employees is what we originally were trying to do, rolling it out for people who were putting themselves at risk and monitor them symptoms daily. And so when we were able to develop and roll out this app, we're really identifying an opportunity also using technology to contact trace for people who find out that they were exposed or for people who are able to see that they were exposed to somebody for whom is now positive for COVID. So we're trying to complement the contact tracing efforts that are currently happening with our public health agencies. We're doing this on our campus as well as employees and students come back to campus. Further, we've been analyzing community mobility data throughout the region and the state. And so that really looks at using anonymized smartphone data and identifying what are the patterns of movement for our community residents. So we were able to use those data and complement them with COVID rates and saying, okay, while we were under the stay-at-home in place orders, what were we seeing? Who was leaving their home and for why? What were the reasons they were leaving their home? So we were able to see the difference in rural and more urban communities. Even the suburban and urban communities were more similar than the rural areas. People were traveling farther in rural communities for work, and we recognize that that's usual, right? So ultimately, people in urban communities travel less distances, and yet rural communities are traveling farther distances. And that wasn't such a concern when the COVID rates weren't really impacted in our rural communities at that time. Now it's shifting, and so we're looking at the patterns differently now. The other thing that we found with those patterns was really looking at why were people leaving their homes in certain areas in the St. Louis region, and they were leaving for full-time work. So we identified what types of patterns of employment they included, things like healthcare support services and food services, and so thinking about those pieces, and transportation, and so thinking about how are those really our essential employees in the time of COVID. They're not what employment looked like as essential employment previously. COVID has introduced this essential term for people who are working in grocery stores or working at support staff for nursing homes and that sort of thing. And so thinking about who is putting themselves at risk, we haven't really fully, I think the next step is to see how does employment serve as a risk factor in this pandemic, where previously it was a predictor of better health outcomes because being employed is better than not being employed. So that's a broad range of all the things we're doing, but it's just actually just the tip of the iceberg is what we've been working on. Thank you. So I think one of the projects that we did earlier on in COVID was mid-March. We did a nationally representative study that looked at geospatial data and who owns those data. So really thinking through about if I had symptoms of COVID, if I was diagnosed with COVID, and who should see those data. And by and large, our 70% of the respondents said, yes, the government should see these data, and they should see other people's data who have infections as well. And I think that felt really good for me, right? So I do research looking at real-time data collection because I think that the technology that we have today really informs our public health and our healthcare needs in ways that we hadn't been able to access before. The challenge with that is people's perceptions change over time. Back then it wasn't perceived a political statement to wear a mask. And so I think that there's likely going to be a shift if we were to conduct the same study now. I wonder if we would have different responses. I think the other flip side is, what do we do? So what do we do? What decisions do we make? And how do we, to think back to what Alex said, how do we best communicate when we're reopening college campuses, for example? How do we get people to say, yes, I want to use this app and I want to monitor my symptoms and tell you where I'm located and let you see where I might be exposed to COVID? I think those are push-pull data privacy challenges, a different slice of it, that there's a community collective response that I feel like there's a shared responsibility, but I think the onus is not equitable. So I think I'd want to couple the idea that there's tons of data available in ways that we didn't traditionally have this much in public health and healthcare before. And so I think we need to recreate what we consider data in those silos and say, these are informing the challenges that we have, understanding the barriers and the protective pieces of our community, so we can better understand and better identify where and how to do some of the work that we need to do. I think our underserved populations have been underserved for a really long time. This is just accelerated. Our COVID response is, the COVID in general has shown us this is what happens when we don't fix these problems that we've known that exist. And so I'm excited about opportunities to say, this is how we can do it differently. This is how we can create equitable employment opportunities that when you're put at risk, these are some safeguards that we can implement that say, this is not going to make you take several hourly wage jobs, or this is what a paid leave looks like. This is what happens when you're sick for your family. This is how we do better for our community members and for the jobs that they take.
Yep.
Got thrown away. So I think of everything has a location lens, and I think everything has an impact on health. That's just the way I think. And so in the work around COVID, I think the work that we are challenged to do is urgent and collective, and the more conversations we have, we develop a better action plan. And so I think that we're going to figure this out. We're going to figure ways to work better together across our silos to better inform the work and research and practice that we can implement going forward. I think the little bit that I can do in that space is my responsibility.
Awesome.
All right. Very relevant and interesting work that Dr. Enball is doing at St. Louis University. It's very informative about taking cell phone data and using that data anonymously, taking your anonymous data, and tracking real public health issues and challenges. So I think that that's something very interesting that the university is doing, not just SLU, but many universities in the U.S. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. As I said, no polls, no handouts. I did drop in the chat box just the link to SLU's Geospatial Institute if you do want further details on that program and what the major is all about. Feel free to click on that and have a look around. As mentioned earlier, next week will be all about U.S. qualifications, becoming a dietitian, nurse, and psychologist in the United States, and what type of qualifications you need to have or what kind of tests you need to take in order to become certified to practice in the U.S. All right, short and sweet Webinar Wednesday this week. Hopefully everyone has a good week and you stay healthy. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.